Hey guys, tonight we're going to travel back in time to the 14th century. Yes, the Middle Ages, a time when life was already difficult enough without the added bonus of an invisible killer. Imagine a world where illness and death were daily companions, but the concept of germs, bacteria, or viruses was completely unknown. Sounds like a nightmare, right? Well, buckle up. You probably won't survive this one. So let's just try to enjoy the ride. Picture it. You're walking down a medieval street, cobblestone beneath your boots, with a distant clanging of blacksmiths working their forges. The air smells a bit musty, maybe like damp wood, and something a little off, a faint tang of decay, but nothing too unusual. After all, what's a bit of rot here and there when everyone seems to be getting along just fine? Little do you know, the world around you is about to change forever. For centuries, plagues had made occasional appearances. The great plagues of antiquity were whispered about, faraway stories, as remote as ancient history itself. But in 1347, all of that changed when the Black Death arrived. The plague wasn't an idea. It wasn't just a distant, forgotten event. It was right there, creeping through your streets. People didn't know what it was, only that it came like a storm, and there was no escaping it. It wasn't some vague story in a history book. It was reality. You might think this doesn't sound too bad, right? After all, people in the Middle Ages were used to hard living. Starvation, disease, war, they were all a part of daily life. But there was something different this time. Something invisible was slipping through the cracks, and no one could quite figure out what it was. Everyone in the town thought they were living normal lives, but this normal was about to get turned upside down. The death toll would be staggering, far more than any battle or famine that had come before. This plague, the Black Death, would make its mark in ways no one could ever fully understand. And in the thick of it all, there were no hospitals, no public health announcements, no modern understanding of viruses. What was happening was like a bad dream that no one could wake up from. It was the ultimate test of human resilience, but no one knew how to fight an invisible enemy. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Life before the plague. Before we dive deeper into the horror of the Black Death, let's take a step back. Picture what life was like in the Middle Ages, just before this deadly wave crashed into Europe. Life in the 14th century wasn't exactly a vacation. In fact, it was hard work just to survive another day, even without a deadly plague lurking in the background. You weren't exactly living the dream. You wake up in a small, dark room, probably shared with a few other family members, maybe even a pig, if you were lucky. Your bed is little more than straw, your roof leaky, and your walls barely keeping out the cold. A simple breakfast might consist of stale bread and a bit of cheese, if you were fortunate. There's no Instagram to distract you, no high-speed internet, and definitely no fancy lattes to start your day. Instead, your biggest worries are what's for dinner, if you can make it through the next harvest, and how to protect your crops from unpredictable weather. Health wasn't exactly a top priority either. People didn't shower, didn't wash their hands, and if they did, it was more of a seasonal thing than a daily habit. You didn't have the luxury of knowing about germs, bacteria, or viruses. If someone got sick, it was just one of those things. Maybe they were cursed, maybe the stars were misaligned, or maybe they just ate something wrong. Your chances of survival were just as much about luck as anything else. Farming was the backbone of life in the medieval world, but it was precarious. A bad harvest could mean famine. A bad winter could mean death. People worked the land, planting, sowing, and hoping that the weather would be kind enough to give them enough food to last through the year. But even that wasn't guaranteed. Disease was always there, creeping in the background, but it wasn't an all-consuming force like the plague would be. But life wasn't all doom and gloom. There were festivals, markets, and communal events that provided a sense of community. People laughed, danced, and celebrated, despite the hardship. Still, no matter how vibrant those moments might have been, the medieval world was anything but a comfortable place. The concept of health and safety was practically non-existent. If you survived to your 30s, you were doing well. And yet, the people of this era had no idea what was about to hit them. Historians still argue whether the medieval period was truly as grim as we make it out to be, or whether we romanticize its hardships. But one thing is certain, life before plague was already hard. The Black Death would change everything, and for many, it would be too much. Medieval hygiene. Now let's talk hygiene. Or rather, the complete and utter lack of it. It's almost like medieval people had a very different idea of what clean was. And I'm not talking about the cleanliness of a fresh pressed suit or a newly laundered bedsheet. No. Cleanliness in the Middle Ages was a completely different concept, where dirt and filth were terms that had more of a lived-in vibe. You wake up in your dimly lit room, perhaps still half dreaming of the fresh air you could never quite seem to find. Your skin feels sticky from the heat of the night, your hair tangled and full of the dust that settled in the corner of your room. You haven't had a proper bath in months, and neither has anyone else in your village. Why? Well, there's the little issue of bathing itself being somewhat unconventional. It wasn't like people actively avoided water. Quite the opposite. But the medieval understanding of hygiene was, shall we say, innovative. Take, for instance, the fact that people in the medieval period believed water was a breeding ground for illness. So, bathing in large quantities of water, in their minds, was pretty much a bad idea. People often cleaned themselves by changing clothes and scrubbing their bodies with cloths, essentially just rubbing dirt around to get rid of the old dirt. But let's not overlook how things were even worse in the winter. No one wanted to leave their home for an icy cold bath, so that layer of grime stuck around, all season long. In cities, public bathhouses existed, but they weren't exactly what you might think. These were communal spaces, where people would squeeze into small, steamy rooms together. And since the concept of personal space was a little different back then, a lot of people shared the same tubs, using the same water until it was a soupy, grimy mess. Still, it's the thought that counts, right? Even more bizarre was the use of perfumed oils and water to mask odors. Let's just say that medieval colognes didn't exactly come with a modern-day disclaimer of, please test for irritation. The scent of rosemary mixed with, well, all the things that were not being washed off. If you wanted to be well-groomed, you would go to great lengths, even rubbing fragrant herbs into your hair, which probably didn't do much except to make things smell like a flower shop during a heat wave. Historians still debate whether this widespread lack of hygiene contributed to the spread of plague, or whether the disease would have spread just as quickly without the extra help. But looking at it from a modern perspective, it's hard not to think that if they had just tossed in a little soap and water, things might have turned out differently. But then again, we wouldn't have as many fascinating stories to tell. Still, there were moments of personal cleanliness, too. In wealthier households, scented oils and perfumes were used, not necessarily because people knew about hygiene, but because it was all about social status. Cleanliness might not have been the point, but looking clean certainly was. The first sight of the plague. It starts slowly, a whisper at the edge of your town. People talk about it in hushed tones. News of a strange sickness in distant lands, creeping steadily towards you. You've heard of plagues before, of course. There were rumors of terrible diseases that would sometimes take out entire villages. But this was different. The first signs were subtle, almost imperceptible, like an ominous fog you can't quite see but know is there. In your town, you don't think much of it at first. Some travelers came from the east, bringing with them news of strange outbreaks, and though it sounds horrifying, it's a story that feels distant. Maybe it won't touch you. After all, these things happen to other people, to other places. You're far enough away. You try to shake off the unease and continue with your daily routine. The hard work, the small joys of market day, the evening meals shared with family. But in the back of your mind, there's a whisper that won't go away. And soon, that whisper turns into a distant scream. It's impossible to ignore when the first cases arrive. One by one, townsfolk begin to fall ill. At first, just a few. Then more. Strange, awful symptoms begin to emerge. Fever, aching limbs, coughing. But the worst part? The strange, dark sores that begin to appear on their skin, swollen, blackened, and bruised. The very sight of them makes your stomach twist. You've seen disease before, but nothing like this. The scent of it, foul and sickly, lingers in the air like a promise of doom. The sickness spreads with terrifying speed. In a matter of days, your town is gripped in panic. At first, people are confused. What is this? What kind of disease is this? Some still hold on to the hope that it will pass, that maybe it's just some temporary illness that will soon disappear. But as the days go by and more people collapse, that hope fades into dread. The streets become quieter. The usual sounds of life are replaced with the unsettling silence of fear. Shops are abandoned, markets empty. No one dares to get too close to the sick, but no one knows what to do. There's no doctor coming to save you. After all, who could cure something so mysterious? The realization slowly creeps in. This isn't just a regular illness. This is something bigger. Something much, much worse. The fear is palpable now. People look over their shoulders at the faintest cough, jump at the softest sneeze. Their hearts race with the thought that it could be them next. And then, just as you begin to process the growing panic around you, the unimaginable happens. The local church bells toll, sending a shiver through the crowd as the announcement is made. The plague has come. It's official now. There's no turning back. Historians still argue about the origins of plague. Was it spread by fleas on rats, or did it travel by other means, perhaps through the very air? Whatever the case, the devastating nature of this pestilence was clear. It would wipe out entire communities, leaving them broken and shattered. No one could have predicted the full scale of its destruction. But right now, in this moment, it doesn't matter how it's spreading. It's here, and no one knows how to stop it. Superstition versus science. As the plague makes its brutal march across Europe, fear grips every heart, and with fear comes confusion. In the face of such a terrifying, invisible enemy, what else can people turn to? They don't have the benefit of modern science or medicine, no knowledge of germs or viruses. What they have, instead, is a reliance on ancient superstitions, rumors, and desperate attempts to make sense of what feels like a personal judgment from the heavens. The people of the 14th century didn't know about microbes, viruses, or pathogens. They had only their beliefs to explain the unexplainable. You stand in the crowd, listening to the whispers. It's the wrath of God. The stars are misaligned. It's the witches who curse at us. In the absence of hard facts, people resort to what they know, what they've been told for centuries. They point fingers at the most obvious scapegoats, those who were different, those who didn't conform. Jews, foreigners, the poor, and anyone seen as other were often blamed for bringing the plague upon the land. In some places, violent mobs would gather, targeting these groups in a twisted belief that by eliminating them, they could lift the curse and save themselves. It's horrifying, and yet it was part of the madness that gripped the world at the time. Some still believed in astrology, looking to the stars for guidance, as though the celestial bodies held the answers to the earth's suffering. They would watch for signs in the heavens, hoping for some cosmic clue that might explain the devastation. Others relied on magical thinking. Amulets, potions, and charms became popular remedies. People would wear strange necklaces made of herbs or bathe in mixtures of purifying substances to ward off the plague. It's almost comical now, isn't it? The thought that a handful of flowers could stand between you and death. But for them, these beliefs were as solid as any scientific theory might seem to us today. Doctors, meanwhile, were just as clueless, but they did try to help. They would prescribe anything from bloodletting to inhaling noxious fumes in an attempt to cleanse the body. The plague doctors, with their grotesque beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, wandered the streets like grim reapers. They weren't necessarily evil, but they were certainly misguided. Their role was based more on superstition than science. They believed that bad air, miasma, was the cause of disease, so they filled their masks with sweet-smelling flowers to ward off this foul air. Of course, that didn't work. But they didn't know that. They had no concept of bacteria or viruses, only vague ideas of bad smells and humors in the body. Historians still argue whether these superstitions were a direct result of the plague's overwhelming nature, or if they were a long-standing feature of medieval life. Regardless, it's clear that in the absence of knowledge, people sought comfort in the familiar, even if that meant turning to fear and blame. Modern science, as we understand it, would have had a better chance of combating the plague. But back then, you had your faith, your beliefs, and maybe, just maybe, a miracle cure. And so, Society clung to these crutches, hoping that something, anything, would make this nightmare stop. Meanwhile, the death toll climbed, and people found themselves lost in a haze of superstition. In the end, there was no magic charm, no astronomical sign, and no healer who could stop the relentless march of the plague. The plague spread. You watch as the plague continues its relentless sweep across Europe, an invisible tide that knows no boundaries. What started as a few isolated cases soon becomes an unstoppable flood, creeping from one town to the next. It spreads quickly, crossing borders, mountains, and seas. People aren't sure how to stop it. They try what they know, prayers, sacrifices, isolation, but nothing seems to work. This is a killer they can't see. And even worse, they don't understand why it's happening. By now, you've seen firsthand how quickly this disease can claim lives. Yesterday, your neighbor was walking down the street, chatting away with friends. Today, they're dead. The disease doesn't just strike the old or the weak. It takes anyone in its path, regardless of age or strength. Children, young adults, and the elderly alike fall victim to it. And it seems there's no rhyme or reason to who survives and who doesn't. One person gets it, and within days they're gone. Another survives, though no one knows why. One of the most terrifying aspects of the plague is its speed. It doesn't wait around. It hits hard, fast, and without warning. In some towns, the disease would tear through the population in a matter of days, decimating entire families. Streets that were once bustling with life would suddenly be eerily empty. Markets were abandoned, fields went unplanted, and the once thriving towns became ghost towns, their walls echoing with the faint sounds of the dead and dying. Families were wiped out in a blink of an eye, and even the wealthiest could do little to protect themselves. The plague didn't care about status. It didn't care if you were rich or poor, noble or peasant. It claimed everyone in its path. This indiscriminate nature of the disease left a trail of devastation, where entire villages, once lively, became desolate. You could walk through a town and not see a single soul, the empty homes serving as silent witnesses to the tragedy that unfolded. The only thing left behind were the survivors, forever changed by what they had witnessed. And how did it spread so fast? Historians still debate this. Some argue that it was carried by rats, their fleas infecting humans, while others suggest that it spread through the air, possibly aided by trade routes that linked the east to the west. No one truly understood the mechanics of the disease, only that it spread like wildfire, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Even the most powerful cities, like Venice and Florence, found themselves unable to defend against it. The disease followed the same routes that merchants and traders used, creeping along the Silk Road and across Europe. And as the plague moved, so did the panic. People fled. Entire communities packed up and ran, hoping to escape the inevitable. But there was no escaping the Black Death. It didn't matter where you went. It was already there, waiting for you. The fear and uncertainty that accompanied the plague spread were suffocating. As you watch the death toll climb, it feels like the world is shrinking around you. There's nowhere left to turn, no place where you can feel safe. But still, people try to go about their daily lives. In some areas, cities were closed off, quarantined from the outside world in a desperate attempt to stop the disease from spreading further. But even the quarantine measures seemed like futile gestures, too little too late. No matter how hard people tried to contain it, the plague was faster, more cunning, and it seemed to have no end. As you sit with your thoughts, watching the carnage unfold, you can't help but feel the crushing weight of uncertainty. How long will this go on? Will you survive? Will your loved one survive? It's a thought that haunts everyone, and even in the darkest moments, it feels like there's no escape. Historians still argue over whether the medieval attempt to quarantine the infected areas were effective or just a doomed effort. Whatever the case, it's clear that the plague spread was unstoppable, and it marked the beginning of a long and painful chapter in human history. One that would change the world forever. Struggling for answers. As the death toll mounts, you find yourself in the same desperate position as everyone else. Clueless, terrified, and scrambling for answers that seem to slip further out of reach with every passing day. You're no doctor, but you've seen enough to know that whatever is happening is not just some ordinary illness. This is unlike anything you've ever encountered. People around you try everything they can think of, Anything to make sense of the chaos, to find some thread of hope in the whirlwind of suffering. Your town is filled with talk of remedies, some sensible, some utterly bizarre. Every day, someone seems to have a new cure. Some people claim that bathing in vinegar or pouring boiling water on themselves will purify the body. Others say that carrying flowers or herbs will ward off the bad air. The miasma they believe is causing the plague. As absurd as it sounds, you see people eagerly grasping for these solutions, holding on to whatever tiny shred of hope they can find, no matter how unlikely it seems. Desperation makes strange bedfellows. Then there are the doctors, the so-called professionals, who are just as lost as everyone else. These men, garbed in their long robes and beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, parade through the town, giving out advice that, frankly, doesn't seem to be doing much good. They have their own theories. Some believe that the disease is spread through bad smells, and others believe it's the wrath of God punishing the people for their sins. None of these explanations hold water, but no one has the scientific knowledge to truly understand what is happening. You wonder how the doctors feel. Do they know they're not helping? Or are they just as frightened, just as clueless as the rest of you? In some places, people have turned to prayer, hoping that divine intervention might stop the plague. They gather in churches, light candles, and beg for forgiveness, pleading for the wrath to end. In many ways, these moments are comforting. The act of coming together in prayer offers a brief sense of control, a fleeting illusion that, if only you could pray hard enough, maybe the plague would go away. But deep down, you know that nothing will change unless something more tangible happens. Yet, even so, you pray. Maybe it's not about belief anymore. Maybe it's just about holding on to something, anything, in a time when the world seems to be crumbling. In the midst of all this confusion, there are those who seek to explain the plague through supernatural means. Some believe that it's caused by witches or sorcerers, dark forces conspiring to bring death upon the land. It seems almost laughable now, but to them, it was a very real fear. They believed that by accusing and punishing those who were different, they could rid the community of these evil influences. It's a dangerous, irrational cycle that only adds to the growing fear, but it's a cycle that people fall into when there's nothing else to explain the devastation they're witnessing. Historians still argue whether the medieval attempt to understand and treat the plague were truly scientific endeavors, or if they were simply desperate, misguided reactions to a world turned upside down. There's no denying that the people at the time were in a state of complete panic. But it's also clear that without the knowledge we have today, there was no way for them to understand what was really happening. They could only grasp at straws, hoping to find an explanation that made sense. As you watch the chaos unfold, you begin to understand that the real struggle isn't just survival. It's trying to make sense of it all. The plague has come, and there's no real understanding of how to stop it. But at least for now, people can hold on to their beliefs no matter how far-fetched they seem. It's something. Maybe it's enough to get through another day. The role of religion. In the face of such overwhelming devastation, it's no surprise that religion took center stage. You find yourself turning more and more to the church, hoping that, somehow, it can provide answers to this madness. After all, in a world where nothing makes sense, the only thing left to hold on to is faith. The church, in its grand, towering presence, has long been a source of solace, community, and most importantly, guidance. Now, as the plague ravages the land, it is seen as a final line of defense against the encroaching darkness. Priests and clergy everywhere preach about penance, urging everyone to confess their sins and seek absolution. The belief that the plague is a punishment from God grows stronger with each passing day. You hear the familiar refrain in every sermon: "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near." But what does it mean? Does God truly want you to suffer? Or are these just empty words in a world where pain and death seem to reign supreme? The questions swirl in your mind, but you can't help but wonder if they matter in a time like this. In the town square, the faithful gather, kneeling in prayer, their faces twisted with fear and longing. Some seek solace in the rituals of the church, hoping that a few whispered prayers will shield them from the plague's wrath. Others find themselves drawn into the arms of the clergy, looking for salvation. The priests, dressed in their flowing robes and golden vestments, seem to hold the answers. At least, that's what the people want to believe. The sound of the church bells ringing fills the air, a comforting, familiar sound that tells you everything will be okay, or at least that there's hope. Yet, for all the faith the people have, the plague continues its deadly course. And here's the troubling thought. For all the prayers, all the processions, the belief that divine intervention might stop the disease seems to be nothing more than wishful thinking. Historians still debate whether the church's response to the plague was one of genuine belief in divine punishment, or whether it was an attempt to maintain power and control in a world that was falling apart. The church offered comfort, yes, but also fueled fear and guilt, creating an environment where the threat of divine wrath was only made worse by the plague itself. You can't help but think that the church's teachings, while soothing, were limited. There was little talk of practical measures to fight the plague, no word on how to combat the disease itself. The plague was just a force of nature, a punishment to be endured, a trial for the soul. And yet, it's hard not to wonder, if the church had embraced new ideas, perhaps even the germ theory of disease, if only they had known about it, might things have turned out differently? Would more lives have been saved? Could science and faith have worked together? Unfortunately, no one had the answers. People had only their belief that somehow, some way, God would deliver them from the plague. In some parts of Europe, the plague became so entwined with religious ideas that people began to seek out extreme measures. Flagellants, groups of self-inflicted sufferers, would roam the streets, whipping themselves in an attempt to appease God. The spectacle of their suffering, of people marching through the streets, bloodied and broken, was a strange form of devotion, an act of atonement for sins that no one could quite pinpoint. Yet, this self-punishment only seemed to escalate the hysteria. Historians still argue whether these religious rituals helped or hindered the fight against the plague. On one hand, they provided a sense of control, of doing something in the face of the helplessness that surrounded people. On the other hand, they probably only worsened the psychological toll on those involved, offering no real protection against the disease that swept through the land. But in the midst of such profound uncertainty, the need for faith was clear. Without it, the people were left with nothing but the fear of death, and that was far too great a burden to bear. Quarantine measures. As the plague continues its march through Europe, people begin to panic. Whole families are struck down, and cities turn into graveyards, with people staggering to their doom in the streets. The response? Quarantine. But, of course, in the 14th century, the idea of isolation was as ill understood as everything else about the disease. Sure, the people in charge could enforce quarantines, but no one knew how to properly do so. It was more like trying to put out a fire with a cup of water than actually containing an inferno. Your town is one of the many that is soon sealed off. Gates are locked, and those on the outside are warned not to come in. It's a grim but necessary step, or so they say. As you look at the closed gates, you can't help but wonder, is this really helping? Or is it just an attempt to regain control in the face of the uncontrollable? With the plague spreading so rapidly, it feels like these measures are too little, too late. In the countryside, where life is already hard, quarantines are equally haphazard. The lord of your area orders that the sick be confined to their homes, and that any visitors be carefully watched. Yet, what does that even mean? How can you separate people who have been living together for years, sharing food and space, now expected to become hermits in their own homes? Some towns even go as far as to bury the dead in mass graves to avoid any further spread. Yet they can't even begin to comprehend that the plague spread has nothing to do with how many bodies are on the street. It's about germs, rats, and fleas, things they can't even see. Some historians still argue about how effective medieval quarantines were in slowing the spread of the plague. The answer? Not much. Sure, cities tried to lock their gates, separate the infected, and keep people from traveling. But the disease didn't care much about walls or locked doors. People were still traveling between towns, carrying with them the invisible enemy that would soon destroy everything in its path. Despite the obvious ineffectiveness of these quarantines, there was a semblance of order, something to do, a measure that people could cling to. But even with the city gates locked and sick people confined to their homes, the disease still spread rapidly, as it found its way into the very places people were trying to avoid: ships, roads, and even the homes of the wealthy who thought they could escape the chaos. The truth was, Isolation didn't stop the plague. It merely gave people something to do, a sense of control in a world where they had none. What's even more ironic is that the poor were often more at risk. The rich could afford to flee, to travel to remote country states, while the poor had nowhere to go but deeper into infected cities. The rich built safe zones while the poor remained trapped, suffering in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. The notion of a safe class of people was just another false comfort in a world that had no idea what true safety looked like. Historians still debate how much impact the early quarantine measures had. Some say they were largely ineffective, pointing out that despite the best attempts, the plague moved through towns and cities at terrifying speed, regardless of barriers. But there is one undeniable thing. The desire for control, even if that control was a facade, kept the people from completely losing hope. It gave them a sense of action, however misplaced. As for you, it feels like a cruel joke. The walls of your town are locked, but what's the point when the plague is already inside? You can feel the oppressive air of fear, the constant, ever-present awareness that it could be your turn next. And while quarantine may have been a gesture of protection, it's hard to shake the feeling that it's just one more failed attempt to stop something that was always too powerful to contain. Plague doctors and their curers. Now, let's talk about those curious figures who became symbols of the plague itself. The plague doctors, with their bird-like masks, long flowing robes, and wide-brimmed hats. They look more like something out of a nightmare than actual medical professionals. You've probably seen pictures of them. The long, beaked mask stuffed with herbs, flowers, and spices, supposedly to ward off the foul air, or miasma, which was believed to carry the plague. These figures are, at this point, legends of their own right, haunting reminders of a time when medicine was a chaotic, hopeless blend of superstition and trial and error. You walk through the streets, seeing one of these masked figures shuffle by, their cloak trailing behind them like a shadow. They're not here to offer real answers, of course. In fact, no one had real answers back then. But that didn't stop these doctors from trying their best, or at least from trying to appear like they knew what they were doing. They were often men, and sometimes women, though that was rarer, hired by local governments or wealthy households to treat the sick. Their qualifications were hardly reassuring. The beaked masks were filled with strong-smelling herbs and spices, meant to protect them from what they thought was the bad air causing the disease. But in reality, they didn't know what was happening at all. The idea of miasma, the belief that bad smells or poisonous vapors from decaying matter cause disease, was a widely accepted theory during the medieval period. So, plague doctors would fill their masks with whatever fragrant herbs they could find, rose petals, lavender, cloves, to ensure they didn't breathe in this toxic air. Meanwhile, they'd carry a long wooden stick to keep a safe distance from the sick, which wasn't a bad idea. But it wasn't really helping anyone either. The treatments these doctors offered were just as bizarre as their attire. Bloodletting was common, with the idea that it would help balance the humors in the body. You can almost imagine the scene. Someone, already weakened by the plague, being drained of their blood in hopes that it might cure them. They might have also been subjected to crude surgeries, like lancing the buboes, the painful, swollen lymph nodes, or they could have been forced to drink foul-smelling potions made from things like mercury, arsenic, or even urine. Remedies that surely did more harm than good. And yet, despite the utter lack of real medical knowledge, these doctors were the ones people turned to. When you're facing an invisible killer, you'll take anything that seems to offer a chance, no matter how ridiculous it may sound. The desperation for answers, for some semblance of control, made these doctors the trusted figures in a time when the very concept of health and disease was utterly misunderstood. What's even stranger is the role these doctors played in perpetuating the panic. In some places, plague doctors were given official authority to pronounce someone dead or sick. In a world so full of superstition and fear, their word could be a death sentence. A plague doctor's note was a ticket to being buried quickly and with minimal fuss, which might have been a relief for some, but it only added to the horror for others who found themselves prematurely diagnosed. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of the plague doctors. Did they play any role in trying to manage the disease, or were they merely a form of reassurance for a panicking public? While there's no evidence to suggest their remedies had any positive effect, they became part of the cultural memory of the Black Death, A strange symbol of a time when medical science was a combination of trial and error, religious belief, and superstition. Looking back, it's almost laughable to think of these doctors with their beaked masks, as if the solution to a pandemic could be found in a few herbs and a long stick. But, in the context of the time, they were the best the medieval world had. That's the tragedy of it all. There were no real answers, no true understanding of what caused the disease, only fear, confusion, and a desperate hope that something, anything, would work. The symptoms of the plague. As the plague spreads through the streets, the symptoms are like nothing anyone has ever witnessed. The air is thick with fear, and you can almost feel the tension hanging over everything. People begin to fall ill with alarming speed. One moment, they're walking down the street, and the next, they're writhing in pain, their bodies ravaged by an unseen force. The symptoms of the plague are terrifying, immediate, brutal, and relentless. It's almost as though the body's very fabric is unraveling right before your eyes. The first signs are subtle enough. A sudden fever, a sharp headache, and a general feeling of weakness that settles over the victim. But it doesn't take long for the real horror to set in. Within a day or two, the skin of the afflicted person becomes hot to the touch, flushed with a feverish glow. They might vomit or cough, but it's when the dreaded buboes start to appear that you know this is no ordinary illness. The infected person's lymph nodes swell to the size of eggs or even apples, becoming tender, painful, and sometimes purple or black in color. The buboes might break open and ooze a dark, foul-smelling pus. But even this isn't the worst of it. The most terrifying symptom is the speed with which everything happens. The plague doesn't wait. Within days, someone could go from feeling slightly ill to death's door. It's a grotesque sight to witness, once healthy bodies turning against their owners. In some cases, the buboes were accompanied by violent coughing fits, with blood pouring from the lungs, staining the person's lips and hands. If the infection made its way to bloodstream, the person could experience feverish delirium and severe joint pain. In the most extreme cases, people would die within hours of showing their first symptoms. Death wasn't just a distant idea. It was a looming presence, creeping closer with every sickening cough. But the real horror lay in the unpredictability. Some people would seem to recover for a time, only to suddenly relapse into the worst stages of the plague. And while some were infected with the buboes would survive, most would not. It wasn't just the sick who were afraid. Everyone was afraid. If you so much as looked at someone who had the slightest hint of a cough, you couldn't help but feel the weight of fear creeping up your spine. The fact that no one understood the cause of these terrible symptoms only deepened the terror. People wondered if it was a curse, a punishment for their sins, or the result of some unexplainable cosmic event. They didn't know about bacteria, viruses, or the role of fleas in carrying the disease. The idea that something so small, so invisible, could cause so much suffering was completely foreign. They only knew that, once the symptoms began, the end was often not far behind. Historians still debate the nature of the plague symptoms, particularly the origin of the dark buboes. Some argue that it was a case of bubonic plague, while others believe it could have been a combination of several diseases, like pneumonic or septicemic plague. There's even some debate about whether the symptoms were exacerbated by poor living conditions, which would make sense given the cramped, unsanitary spaces people lived in. The mystery surrounding the plague symptoms remains one of the most intriguing aspects of its history. But the undeniable truth is this. The Black Death was not just a disease. It was a nightmare made flesh, a horrific ordeal that left people grasping for answers they would never find. As you watch the sick and the dying, you can't help but wonder if you're next. The symptoms are everywhere, and with no cure in sight, it feels like you're living on borrowed time. It's a world where the only certainty is uncertainty. One moment, you're fine, and the next, you're staring into the abyss. Societies collapse. The plague doesn't just devastate health. It breaks down everything. The fabric of society, the systems that have held communities together for generations, begins to unravel. You can feel it as you walk through the streets. There's a noticeable shift in the atmosphere, a weight that presses down on everyone. It's as though the very foundation of your world is cracked, and no one knows what to do next. The markets that once bustled with life now lie empty. You pass by abandoned shops, their wooden shutters half closed, with no one left to sell or buy. The sound of life, The chatter of merchants, the laughter of children, the calls of the town criers, are gone. Now it's a ghost town, echoing only with the quiet footsteps of the fearful. The social order, which once seemed so certain, begins to collapse under the pressure of the plague. No one knows who's safe. No one knows who to trust. The peasants, the workers, the nobles, none are spared. And with no clear answers, the distinctions between classes start to blur. Rich families, once so sure of their immunity, now flee to their country estates. But even they are not immune. The disease follows them, creeping into their palaces, their manor houses, their safe havens. The idea that money could keep death at bay is shattered. The poorest, who were already accustomed to hardship, are left to fend for themselves in the midst of the chaos. But even they know that wealth doesn't matter anymore. What use is gold if you're dead? The collapse extends beyond the immediate effects on daily life. The economy is in free fall. Trade grinds to a halt as roads become deserted, and goods sit unsold in warehouses. Farmers leave their fields, and merchants shut their doors. The entire system of exchange, money, goods, services, crumbles when there's no one left to buy or sell. In many places, there's simply no one left to work. With so many dead, labor becomes scarce, and what once was a steady rhythm of life is replaced with a staggering silence. Crops go unharvested. Wheat rots in the fields. And yet, despite all this, the plague isn't the only threat you face. Famine is just around the corner, a secondary catastrophe that will emerge in the wake of the disease. As the months drag on, the survivors are left to pick up the pieces. But how do you rebuild when everything you knew has been shattered? The old world is gone, and the new one seems uncertain, unrecognizable. The effects on the psyche of the survivors are just as profound as the physical devastation. The memory of the plague, of all those who died, is a shadow that looms over every waking moment. How do you go on? How do you find purpose when everything has been reduced to rubble? Historians still debate how the Black Death impacted social structures, and whether it acted as a catalyst for major changes. Some argue that the plague helped bring about the end of feudalism, as labor became more valuable and peasants demanded higher wages. Others believe that the social order was merely temporarily disrupted, with things returning to normal once the immediate crisis had passed. What's clear, however, is that the plague forced society to confront its vulnerabilities. The belief in a divinely ordained social hierarchy was shaken to its core, and the idea that people were powerless in the face of something as mysterious as disease became painfully apparent. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of society's collapse was the erosion of trust. Neighbor turned against neighbor. Families turned against one another. As people grew desperate, they began to turn on those who were sick, hoping to save themselves, though no one really knew how to avoid the plague. Paranoia spread as quickly as a disease. There was no sense of community left. Everyone was a potential threat, a walking plague carrier. For you, walking through the empty streets, it feels like the end of the world. The quiet is deafening, and every step you take seems to echo through the hollow town, a stark reminder of what's been lost. You can feel in the air the weight of the survivors, the confusion of those who remain, and the suffocating uncertainty of the future. Historians still argue about how long it took for society to recover from the Black Death. Some say it took decades for the economic and social systems to find any semblance of stability again. Others claim the effects were felt for much longer, perhaps even up to a century. But one thing is certain. Whatever happens, the world will never be the same. The collapse you're witnessing now is only the beginning of a long journey towards rebuilding a broken world. The dance of death. In the wake of such suffering, it's no surprise that the plague became intertwined with new, haunting cultural phenomenon. The dance of death, a morbidly poetic symbol of the times. It was the embodiment of the grim reality that even the highest nobleman or the humblest beggar was equal before death. You can almost feel the shadow of it looming over everything. The idea that death wasn't a distant, abstract concept, but an ever-present companion, was becoming ingrained in the culture. People began to view life as something fleeting, something fragile that could be snatched away at any moment. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, as it came to be called, was depicted in art and literature, showing figures from all walks of life, kings, priests, peasants, dancing with skeletons. It was a grim reminder that no one was safe, That death danced just behind every corner, ready to claim you at any time. The images were everywhere. Paintings, murals, poems, even plays. It was as if the plague had opened people's eyes to the inevitable, and they responded by embracing the darkness with a strange, twisted acceptance. For you, walking through the decimated town, the images come alive in your mind. You see them in the empty windows of homes, in the silent streets. The dance is everywhere, even in the things that were once so full of life, now only shadows of what they used to be. And though the dance of death may have been a form of cultural expression, it also served as a coping mechanism for the people. What else could you do but laugh in the face of something so horrifying, so indiscriminate? The dance, with all its darkness, was a way of accepting the unavoidable, a way of making peace with the fact that no one, not even the richest or most powerful, could escape death's grasp. It was a deeply unsettling phenomenon, but one that made sense in its own way. How could you go on living after experiencing such devastation? What else could you do but acknowledge death as an inseparable part of life? There was no denying it anymore. It was as though society had been forced to confront its own mortality in a way it had never done before. The art and culture of the time reflected this. Memento mori, a Latin phrase meaning, remember that you must die, became a common theme in the art of the period. It wasn't just a reminder. It was a mantra, an ever-present shadow that loomed over everything, telling people that death was part of life, that life, in fact, could no longer be lived without the constant reminder of death. Historians still debate the impact of this cultural shift. Did the dance of death represent a broader existential crisis, or was it simply a response to the overwhelming suffering of the time? It's likely both. People's views on life, death, and everything in between were irreversibly changed by the plague. Life could no longer be taken for granted. Every day was a gift, and it was acknowledged as such with grim reverence. The dance of death wasn't just a collection of macabre imagery. It was a lived experience of people who had seen firsthand how fragile and fleeting life really was. As you walk through the empty streets, you can't help but feel a strange connection to those who came before you. The dance of death isn't just something in the art or the stories. It's here, now. It's in the quiet, in the air, in the ghostly silence that surrounds you. The world is forever changed, and the plague has left an indelible mark on everything. Death, which once seemed so distant, now feels immediate, like a shadow that follows you wherever you go. And as the dance of death continues, you realize that this is the only truth that remains. You may not know what tomorrow holds, but you can be sure of one thing. It will be another step in that slow, inevitable dance. Medieval medicine versus the plague. As the plague ravages the land, one can't help but look to the medical professionals of the time, if you can even call them that. Medieval medicine, in all its wisdom, was a mix of superstition, trial and error, and occasionally a bit of common sense, though mostly absent during the worst times. You watch in horror as people are treated by the village healer, a figure who, though well-meaning, is no better equipped to deal with the plague than the common man. This is the era of untested theories, crude remedies, and medical practices that would make modern doctors cringe. But at the time, it was all anyone had. You watch a man, the local apothecary, mixing strange concoctions of herbs and powders, shaking his head and muttering incantations under his breath. He insists that the disease can be driven out by a mixture of wine, garlic, and a little bit of mercury. But you know, deep down, that there's no chance this will work. You've heard about bloodletting, the common remedy for just about anything. But surely draining someone's blood isn't going to make the plague go away. And yet, here they are with a bowl and a razor, ready to cut away at the sickness in the most backward way imaginable. It's almost comical, isn't it? The lengths people go to, trying to outsmart the plague with folk remedies and herbs, believing that a few leaves or a handful of aromatic spices can save them. It's like trying to stop a storm with a simple umbrella. You might hope for a miracle, but it's all hopeless in the face of something so powerful. The doctors, if they can even be called that, suggest treatments that are as misguided as they are numerous. Boiling the body in vinegar, applying leeches to balance the humors, or drinking strange concoctions are all part of the treatment plan. But none of it works. It never does. In fact, there are some who go so far as to try to scare the disease away. They put to use some of the most absurd methods imaginable, from covering the body with mixture of chicken dung and oil to burning incense in the hope of purging the bad air. The plague, however, doesn't seem to care about such rituals. It doesn't care about how much garlic you eat or how much blood you lose. It doesn't even care that people are desperately trying to pray their way out of it. It's a force that doesn't listen to pleas or remedies. It just takes, without regard for logic or effort. Historians still debate whether medieval medicine, in its crude form, had any real effect on the course of the plague. Some argue that the treatments, while misguided, might have alleviated some of the symptoms and made the survivors feel like they were doing something, even if it was wrong. Others believe that these treatments did nothing but make people suffer more. Either way, it's hard to argue that they didn't at least keep the villagers busy while the disease claimed its victims. One thing is for certain, though, medieval medicine was a far cry from the knowledge we have today. The doctors of the time had no understanding of germs or bacteria, no knowledge of viruses, no antibiotics or vaccines. They had only their beliefs, their superstitions, and a whole lot of guesswork. They were as much victims of the plague as the people they tried to treat, caught in a storm of fear, ignorance, and helplessness. Watching the efforts of these doctors only deepens your sense of helplessness. They aren't bad people, not by any means. They're just caught in a time when the world hadn't yet discovered the things that could have saved them. The medical community of the day had no way of knowing what was truly happening. What they needed, what everyone needed, was a different kind of knowledge, something that wouldn't come until centuries later. So you watch, helpless and a little bewildered, as these doctors, with all their strange methods and ineffective treatments, try to stave off the inevitable. Their desperation is palpable, but it's not enough. No amount of herbs, no amount of bloodletting can save the people who are already infected. And as the plague continues its deadly march, you're left with one uncomfortable truth. The medieval world was not prepared for something as horrifying as the Black Death, and no amount of medieval medicine was going to stop it. Plague survivors. Not everyone perishes in the wake of the Black Death, though the toll it takes is unimaginable. As you walk through the deserted streets, there's a strange, unsettling silence. No laughter, no bustling crowds, no casual greetings. But then, in the quiet corners of the town, you find them, the survivors. They're the ones who lived through the nightmare, the few who made it out on the other side. Their faces are gaunt, their eyes hollow with the weight of what they've witnessed. You can see it in their walk, in their posture, a kind of weariness that never quite leaves them. There's no joy in surviving the plague. Not really. What could you possibly feel after losing so much? After watching friends, family, neighbors fall one by one, while you remain untouched by both the sickness and the grief of loss. For many survivors, the very act of continuing to live becomes a kind of guilt. Why was it them and not me? What made them die while I lived? It's a question that lingers in the air like the faintest echo, an unanswered riddle that gnaws at your soul. The survivors are left in a strange limbo. They're not the lucky ones who escaped the plague untouched, nor are they the victims who perished. Instead, they are caught somewhere in between, existing in the ruins of a world they once knew. They live in a place of survival, but survival without joy, without hope. They go through the motions, try to rebuild their lives, try and make sense of it all. But the shadow of death never quite leaves them. They're different now, of course. No one could go through something like this and remain unchanged. Their minds are scarred, their hearts hollow. They can't look at life the same way anymore, not after seeing how fragile everything really is. Before the plague, there was hope, there was ambition, there was a belief that life would continue in its normal rhythm. Now that rhythm is broken. There is only uncertainty and the faintest hope that somehow something will emerge from the wreckage. But what do you do when the world you once knew is gone? How do you begin again when everything around you feels like a ghost of its former self? The survivors try to pick up the pieces, but those pieces don't fit the way they used to. They try to return to work, to start rebuilding. But how do you rebuild when half your village is dead, when trade has come to a halt, when the roads are empty and the markets are still? It's a slow, painful process. Some survivors begin to reestablish a sense of community, but it's not the same. People don't trust each other the way they did before. Everyone is marked by the plague, by loss, by fear, by trauma, and that trauma runs deep. The survivors look around and wonder, is this the world we were left with? What happened to all the people we loved? And how do we move forward without them? In some cases, the survivors return to religious faith, try and make sense of their suffering through prayer and penance. In others, they turn inward, becoming more insular and distrustful, not wanting to form connections with others, afraid that they will lose them too. The plague has left its mark on them, not just physically, but emotionally, and in many ways, that's the most difficult scar to heal. Historians still debate the psychological toll the plague took on survivors. Some believe that the trauma caused by witnessing such widespread death and suffering reshaped the medieval mindset. Others argue that, over time, people adapted, eventually returned to life as it was. But whatever the case, the survivors never fully recover. They may build new families, new lives, but they'll always carry the memory of the plague with them, in the same way you carry the memory of the storm that tore through your life. It leaves a mark that can never quite fade. For you, as one of the survivors, the future seems uncertain. You can't escape the memory of what happened, of who was lost, and what you lived through. But at least you're still here. You are one of the few who made it. But what now? What happens when the world has already fallen apart, and you are left standing alone in the wreckage? The world may never truly understand what it means to survive something like this. It's a quiet survival, a kind of living death. But, in a way, survival is all there is, and as you watch the world slowly begin to rebuild, you can't help but wonder what the future will bring. Will it be like the past? Or will it always be marked by the shadow of what has come before? Psychological toll of the plague. For those who survived the plague, life after the storm is far from what it once was. It's not just a physical destruction that lingers. It's the psychological wreckage, the weight of loss, fear, and trauma that doesn't just vanish when the last body is buried. If anything, it's even more present now, like a ghost that refuses to leave, hanging heavy in the air. Walking through the town, you notice the difference in people. They no longer greet each other with the same warmth, the same trust. Their faces are drawn, their eyes wary, as if death is never far from their thoughts. A casual cough in the distance, a stranger's glance, and suddenly, their shoulders tense, their faces pale. The psychological scars of the plague are visible in every movement, every expression. Survivors are hyper-aware of death, as if it could strike again at any moment. And perhaps, in some ways, it will. The fear that once seemed abstract is now tangible, a palpable presence in the air. You can see it in the way people interact. There's no more casual touch between friends or family, no more embraces after long absence. Everything is guarded. And why wouldn't it be? After all, the plague struck without warning, taking away the ones you loved in the blink of an eye. Now, no one dares to form deep connections with others, for fear that they will be taken just as quickly. It's not just the grief of losing loved ones. It's the trauma of watching people die and not be able to stop it, not knowing why. It's the trauma of seeing the fragility of life laid bare, of feeling utterly helpless in the face of something so powerful, so inevitable. The question of whether or not life can ever truly return to normal hangs in the air. People don't talk about it, but you know they think about it. How do you go back to living when the world you once knew is gone? How do you look at the future with any hope when the past is a never-ending series of painful memories? For survivors, the past is a jagged, painful thing, full of faces that are gone, voices that are silent, and places that no longer feel like home. They try to rebuild, but every step forward feels like a struggle, a tug-of-war between the future they want and the past that refuses to let go. Historians still debate how long the psychological effects of the plague lasted. Some argue the trauma was a long-lasting undercurrent, affecting people for generations, while others believe that society eventually adapted, with time dulling the sharp edges of grief. What is clear, however, is that the Black Death left its imprint on the collective psyche. Fear, uncertainty, and suspicion became permanent features of daily life. People no longer saw the world through the same lens. They understood, perhaps for the first time, just how fragile life was, and that understanding was hard to shake. You can feel it in the air as you walk through the town, a sense of unease, of something that has been irrevocably broken. The plague is over, but its shadow remains. It haunts the streets, the homes, and the people who are still trying to pick up the pieces. It's not something you can see, not something that can be measured, but it's there. The weight of loss, the burden of survival, the knowledge that life is never as secure as you thought it was. It's a strange kind of living death, isn't it? You're alive, yes, but you're not the same. You're changed, and so is everyone else. The plague may be gone, but the fear instilled will never truly fade. It's woven into the very fabric of existence now, a part of the world you live in, a quiet, invisible companion that will follow you wherever you go. The aftermath, a changed world. As the Black Death slowly fades into the past, a new world begins to take shape. One that is, in many ways, unrecognizable from the world that existed before the plague. The streets, once bustling with life, now feel eerily empty. Where there were once vibrant markets, there are now vacant lots, abandoned homes, and empty spaces where people used to gather. The world has changed, but the question remains, has it changed for the better? You walk through the town now, noticing how the landscape has shifted. The population is smaller, far smaller than it was before the plague, and the people who remain seem different. They are quieter, more cautious. Their eyes dart around, always looking for signs of danger. You can feel the weight of the plague's impact in every glance, every whisper, every movement. It's as though the very fabric of society has been torn, and though it's being sewn back together, the stitches are uneven, frayed, and uncertain. One thing becomes clear as you observe the world around you. The plague has fundamentally altered how people view life and death. No longer do they take life for granted, as they once might have. There's a heightened awareness of mortality in the air, a shared understanding that life is fragile and death can come at any time. The attitudes toward work, wealth, and family shift. People no longer place as much value on accumulating wealth or material goods. Instead, they turn inward, focusing on what truly matters: their families, their health, and their survival. The pursuit of a better life is replaced by the simple act of surviving, of making it through another day. The economic landscape has been forever altered as well. Entire industries have collapsed, unable to survive the devastation wrought by the plague. The once flourishing trade routes are now shadows of what they were, as merchants, too, were claimed by the disease. Yet, paradoxically, the collapse of the old order opens up space for change. With so many dead, land and resources that were once tightly controlled by the wealthy are now available for those who survived. The peasants, the laborers, those who once had little, find themselves with newfound power. They demand higher wages, better conditions, and more control over their lives. In many ways, the plague accelerates the decline of feudalism, giving rise to a new social order where wealth and power are more fluid, more distributed. As the survivors begin to rebuild, they face the difficult task of reimagining the world they inhabit. They don't have the luxury of nostalgia, of longing for a world that no longer exists. Instead, they must confront the reality that their society has been forever altered, that the old ways are gone. The future is uncertain, but it is also full of possibilities. Historians still argue about the long-term effects of the Black Death. Did it lead to the rise of the Renaissance? As some believe, by breaking down old societal structures and opening the door to new ideas and ways of thinking? Or was the aftermath more complex, a mixture of devastation and slow recovery that took centuries to fully heal? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain: the world after plague was a world forever changed. It was a world where death was no longer an abstract concept, but a daily, ever-present reality. A world where survivors, scarred, frightened, and scarred in ways they could never fully articulate, were left to rebuild not just their homes, but their hearts and minds as well. For you, as one of the survivors, the rebuilding is a slow, uncertain process. There are no easy answers, no quick fixes. The scars of the past, both physical and psychological, are deep, and yet, despite the uncertainty, there's a quiet hope that the world will continue, that life will go on. It won't be the same as before, but perhaps it doesn't need to be. Maybe, in the aftermath of such devastation, there is room for something new to emerge, a different kind of world, a different kind of life. But one thing is clear: It will be a life marked by the plague, a life where the memory of what happened will never fully fade. Lessons forgotten. The Black Death left behind more than just devastation. It left lessons, harsh, painful lessons that, like the plague itself, were impossible to ignore. And yet, as time marches on, it becomes clear that many of those lessons would be forgotten, or perhaps, more accurately, discarded in favor of the familiarity of old ways. You watch as people rebuild their lives, trying to find normalcy again. But there's something about the human condition that makes us want to return to what we know. Even after the plague, even after devastation, it's all too easy to fall back into the same patterns, the same habits, and the same mistakes. In the years following plague, the survivors, weary and broken, begin to rebuild their towns and their societies. The old world starts to reassert itself. Trade slowly resumes, though it's nowhere near the volume it once had. Agriculture begins to recover, as fields are replanted and crops begin to grow again. Yet, despite the outward appearance of recovery, there's an undeniable sense that the lessons of the plague have been lost in the rush to return to what was once comfortable. People go back to their lives, but now, there's a distinct fear in the air, a lingering anxiety that wasn't there before. The plague may be gone, but the memory of it lives on, haunting the minds of those who survived. Yet, after a time, this fear becomes less about preparation and more about denial. As generations pass, fewer and fewer people remember the weight of what came before. The realities of the plague become distant stories, abstract lessons that can be read about in books, but aren't felt in the same way as they once were. Historians still argue whether the lessons of the Black Death were truly forgotten or whether they were simply ignored in the name of progress. The advancements that followed, the rise of new economic systems, the improvements in medical knowledge, the societal shifts, are often seen as the fruits of the plague's aftermath. But were they truly built on the lessons learned from such devastation? Or were they simply the result of new forces, new ideas, and new opportunities that emerged when the old systems collapsed? It's a question that still lingers in the air, unanswered, just as the memory of the plague does. As the centuries roll on, the memory of the Black Death fades further into the past. People start to look back at it not as a defining moment in history, but as a mere footnote, a tragedy that happened long ago. And yet, the truth is that the plague reshaped the course of history. It forced people to confront their own mortality, to reevaluate the social structures that had governed their lives. It introduced fear into the collective psyche, a fear that still reverberates through society even today. And in a sense, the plague's influence never truly disappears. It just changes shape. You can't help but wonder, how many times have we, as a society, ignored the lessons of the past? How many times have we rebuilt our lives without fully understanding the consequences of what came before? In a way, the human condition is always the same. We rise from the ashes, rebuild, and move forward, all while forgetting the very things that could have prevented the next catastrophe. The Black Death, in all its horror, taught us many things, but whether we truly learn from it is another question entirely. And so, as time moves forward, we continue to live with the consequences of what we have forgotten, just as the people after the plague did. We repeat the same patterns, the same mistakes, because we think we are invincible, because we want to believe that it won't happen to us. The world may change, but the lessons we fail to learn seem to remain the same. Historians' views on the plague. As the centuries pass, the Black Death becomes more of a legend than a lived reality. To those who did not experience it firsthand, it's easy to forget the magnitude of what the world went through. For you, as a survivor, the plague's impact is still vivid in your mind. Its brutality, its swift devastation. Yet, to historians and scholars, the Black Death becomes a subject of debate, an event to analyze and dissect through the lens of time, trying to make sense of it through the detached objectivity of research and inquiry. Historians continue to study the plague, sifting through the accounts left behind by survivors, examining the numbers of dead, and debating the wider implications of the event. They pore over old texts and documents, looking for clues that might finally answer the questions that have lingered for so long. How did it spread so quickly? What were the real causes of the plague? How much did it really change society? And, most importantly, what can we learn from it? The questions seem simple, but the answers remain elusive. Some historians argue that the plague was a turning point in European history, one that led to the collapse of feudalism and the eventual rise of a new social order. The drastic loss of life meant that labor became more valuable, and the old structures of power began to shift. Others argue that, while the plague may have accelerated certain changes, the social and economic systems quickly regained their previous form once the immediate devastation had passed. The power dynamics that had been in place for centuries didn't disappear overnight. In fact, it took generations for the full effect of the Black Death to manifest in terms of political change. And even then, it wasn't the plague alone that caused these changes. It was the combined forces of war, famine, and growing unrest in the centuries that followed. Historians still debate the extent to which the Black Death directly influenced the course of the Renaissance. Some point to the dramatic shifts in artistic expression, technological advancements, and philosophical thought as proof that the plague played a major role in shaping the intellectual landscape of Europe. Others believe that the changes were more the result of a general atmosphere of intellectual curiosity and cultural growth that was already brewing before the plague. The Black Death, they argue, was simply a catalyst, a horrible event that forced people to reevaluate their lives and their place in the world, but not necessarily the spark for the Renaissance itself. It's difficult to pin down the exact effects of the Black Death, and even now, centuries later, it remains a topic of heated discussion among historians. Was it a singular, transformative event that reshaped the entire world? Or was it just one more disaster in a long line of misfortunes that plague humanity throughout history? Some historians argue that the changes brought about by the plague were fleeting, while others contend that the impact was far-reaching, creating conditions for new social and economic systems to emerge. For you, the survivor, the plague's legacy isn't something that can be debated or theorized. It's something you've lived. You don't need to read history books or hear academic arguments to understand the profound effect it had on the world. You saw it with your own eyes. You felt it in the deepest recesses of your being. The Black Death was real. It changed everything. And while historians may spend their lives trying to figure out the exact details of how and why it happened, you'll always carry its impact with you, in a way no textbook ever could. And so, the legacy of the plague lives on, not just in the academic debates of historians, but in the quiet, personal memories of those who lived through it. It's a legacy of survival, of loss, of trauma, and of rebuilding. The Black Death was not just an event in the past. It was a defining moment in the history of humanity, a reminder how fragile life is, how unpredictable fate can be. Historians may never agree on all the details, but for you and for the countless others who survived, the impact of the plague will never be up for debate. It's a truth that is felt deeply, and it's one that time will never fully erase. The legacy of the plague. As the years pass and the shadow of the plague slowly fades into history, the world begins to rebuild. The devastation of the Black Death still looms in the collective memory of those who survived, but for the generations that follow, it becomes a part of the distant past, a horrific chapter in a history that feels as though it belongs to another time. Yet, despite the passing of centuries, the plague's legacy endures in ways that cannot be measured, seen, or fully understood. The ripple effects of such a transformative event continue to shape the world long after the final corpse was buried. The survivors, now the older generation, look on as their children and grandchildren grow up in a world that is radically different from the one they once knew. The scars of the plague remain, not just in the physical emptiness of once thriving towns and villages, but in the more subtle shifts in how people live their lives. The plague forced a fundamental rethinking of what was important. Society was no longer centered solely around pursuit of wealth or power. Instead, people began to place greater value on personal connections, on health, on life itself. For the first time, people understood, in the deepest part of their souls, just how fragile everything was. The plague didn't just alter how people lived. It changed how they thought about life. Philosophers and thinkers, while still debating the finer points of their craft, began to explore new ideas about the nature of existence, the fragility of life, and the certainty of death. Artists, too, responded to changing times, creating works that depicted the human condition in stark, sometimes bleak terms. The dance of death, a popular motif in the years following the plague, reminded people that death was always lurking, always just one step behind. This awareness didn't result in a culture of fear. Instead, it inspired a kind of stoic acceptance. Life, they realized, was brief, and it was precious precisely because of that. Yet, for all the philosophical, social, and cultural shifts, the Black Death didn't just disappear. Its legacy continued to shape the development of medicine, economics, and social structures. Though many of the specific lessons of the plague were forgotten, who remembers the dark herbs of the plague doctors or the superstitions about the miasma? The overarching lesson remains. Society must be prepared for the unexpected. The emergence of more advanced public health measures in the following centuries, the eventual rise of the scientific method, and the shift towards more modern understandings of disease are all part of the indirect legacy of the Black Death. Still, in the quiet moments of your life, there's a part of you that knows the Black Death will never truly be gone. Its legacy, in some form, lives on in each of us. The fear of death, the understanding of its inevitability, and the memory of the pain we all experience. These things don't fade. They become part of who we are, part of the collective memory of humanity. You will always carry the weight of the plague, no matter how many generations pass. It's not just a memory. It's a lesson learned in the hardest way possible. And like all such lessons, it shapes you in ways that can never be undone. In the end, the legacy of the Black Death is not simply about the deaths it caused, the suffering inflicted, or the societal changes it triggered. It's about survival. It's about the resilience of those who lived through it, who carried on and rebuilt, even when there was no clear path forward. It's about how humanity, in its darkest hour, finds a way to keep going, to keep living, to keep hoping. The plague may have wiped out half the population, but it couldn't extinguish the spirit of those who survived. And so, the world moves forward, forever marked by the Black Death. Its legacy, both subtle and profound, lives on in ways we may never fully understand. But if there's one thing that the survivors knew, one thing that they learned above all else, it's that life, fragile and fleeting as it is, goes on, and it is in that continuation, that act of simply surviving, that the true legacy of the Black Death endures. It seems that we have reached the end of the journey. The story of the Black Death has been told, from the first whispers of the plague to its legacy that still echoes through time. Every moment has been lived, every lesson learned, and the tale of survival, loss, and transformation has been woven together. Now, as the story fades into silence, we return to the present. The shadows of history, as heavy as they are, no longer feel quite as oppressive. Life, fragile and fleeting, continues. And we, like those before us, find ways to keep moving forward, to rebuild, to learn, and to live. As you drift into sleep, remember that history is never truly gone. It is carried in every one of us, in the lessons we've learned, in the strength we carry with us, even in the darkest of times. Rest well, and dream of a world that continues to evolve, one step at a time. Sweet dreams.